Good morning again. I'm so happy to be here sharing these ideas with you about prayer. This is a lifelong exploration for me. Now, although, as I told Miss Ann, I was raised and religiously educated in the Unitarian Universalist faith, my first lessons about prayer came not from the Sunday school of the Community Church of New York, but from Mimi, my very traditional Pennsylvania Lutheran grandmother. Mimi was a very polite and genteel woman, but she could not hide from me the ongoing distress she had about the way I was being educated religiously. In fact, the truth is, I don't think Mimi ever got over the fact that her daughter, my mom, married a Jewish man. I remember she used to take me aside for secret talks. "You don't need to tell your mother and father about this," she would say. And then she would try to pass on to me some of what she believed true religion to be. One time she asked me if I had ever learned anything in school yet about evolution. When I answered in the affirmative, she gave me the Genesis version of how the earth was created. And then she said, "Now, when you take tests in school, you write down just what the teacher says because we want you to get good grades, but know in your heart that that's not the way it really happened." So Mimi also taught me how to pray. Her method, which I later rejected as stilted and meaningless, was actually appealing to a small child seeking spiritual solace and getting precious little guidance in that department from her own Sunday school. Because you see, the religious education philosophy of the 50s and 60s in our faith was very much science and reason based. There wasn't, it felt to me, a lot of room for exploring that childlike sense of mystery and awe. At least that's how I remembered it. So Mimi gave me this prayer formula that had 4 steps. First, you tell God about all the things you're grateful for. Then you tell him, and yes, for Mimi, God was definitely a him, all the things that you have done that you were sorry for, and you ask for forgiveness. Then you ask God to bless all the people you love and care about and anyone you know who needs help. And then finally, you can ask God for the things that you really want. Now, my relationship with Mimi's God and Mimi's form of prayer finally broke down over that last item because I tried to faithfully say my prayers that way: gratitude, confession, blessing. And then I would always end my prayer with the same respectful request. Since that request was never granted, after a while it became clear to me, a rational, intelligent Unitarian Universalist child, well-schooled in the scientific method, that God was not listening. Who needs that, I thought, and washed my hands of the whole God prayer business. For a while, anyway. In his spiritual autobiography called Markings, Dag Hammarskjöld tells us, God does not die on the day when we cease to believe in a personal deity, but we die on the day when our lives cease to be illumined by the steady radiance renewed daily of a wonder, the source of which is beyond all reason. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, we may sometimes, like I did, feel the absence of that sense of wonder. We are a religious people who place the use of reason squarely in the center of our faith. Can we also claim an experience beyond reason? I think so, because there's a difference between that which is unreasonable, which makes no sense, abrogates the laws of nature, and betrays our minds, and that which is just beyond reason where wonder dwells in the realm of the spiritual, a realm that we are embracing and exploring more and more. In our statement of principles and purposes, we claim as the first source of our living tradition direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. Now, that statement reflects to some extent the legacy of the radical Reformation. Way back then, we are the people, our forebears are the people who insisted on the primacy of personal experience. There's also an echo of the transcendentalists in there, those 19th century spiritual forebears of ours who reminded their very rational Unitarian friends that people needed to experience the holy directly, not just talk about it or think about it, but experience it. For the transcendentalists, encounters with the holy could happen in nature, in solitary contemplation, in music, and even in human conversation. They were concerned with the cultivation of the soul, that's William Ellery Channing's term, through whatever practice brought the individual into awareness of the experience of transcendence. Mary Oliver's poem about encountering the deer in the woods is a perfect example of encountering the divine in nature. But that kind of spiritual encounter will only happen if you are open to it. Some years ago, Franco Ferrucci wrote an autobiography of God, tongue-in-cheek. It's entitled A History of God as Told by Himself. In this book, himself talks about his frustrations over the years with trying to make himself known to people who were supposed to be religious. He includes an audience with the Pope, in which the Pope is consistently unaware of his presence, conversations with Christian mystics in which they consistently misunderstand his communications, and even an extended visit with Herman Melville during the writing of Moby Dick. Now, Ferrucci's tongue-in-cheek description of God's frustration at making God's self known to the professionally religious only serves to remind us that while it is true that we are occasionally surprised by grace, blessed in spite of ourselves, our spiritual depths are more likely to be plumbed when we are deliberately open to our own personal encounter with the holy. We have to pay attention. We have to be open. Openness is the essential attribute that allows us to experience the transcendent. Robert Raines uses the term falling into mystery to describe it. Falling into mystery will mean different things to different people, but the result will always be a direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder. So what does all this have to do with prayer? Prayer is one way that we can fall into mystery. I pray, but I don't do what many people think of when they use the word prayer. My prayer is not a letter dictated to God with a list of demands and concessions. Once in seminary, and it was a Methodist seminary, a fellow student, confused as to what we were really about, asked me if we pray. Well, some of us do, I answered. Well, whom do you pray to? Was her response. And I tried to explain that the kind of prayer I'm talking about renders that question irrelevant. Prayer is not a speech addressed to a bigger and better and more powerful person by a little inadequate person. Prayer is a process of opening oneself to falling into mystery. It is a process of reaching deep inside of oneself to the pools of pain and joy that may defy rational description. In those pools, I have found the strength to cope with losses that had initially felt unsurvivable, and the fortitude to live through days of doubt and confusion that at first seemed unbearable. In those pools, I have found, to my surprise and delight, the capacity to love beyond all expectation and the energy to pursue possibilities that I would have laughed off had reason been given the only vote. And perhaps most importantly, in those pools, I have found the courage to surrender aspects of life which I had despaired of ever controlling, and yet whose loss felt initially unacceptable. But prayer is more than just reaching inside. It is also making a connection between those interior depths and something outside of us, beyond us, something unfathomably other. Not just swimming inward, in Mary Oliver's words, but flowing outward. Falling into mystery and trusting that something, whether you call it God or life or the good, will catch you in your free fall and bring you gently back to earth, standing on your feet once again. Prayer is, in A. Powell Davies' words, the language of the heart, And the language of the heart is not always the most articulate or the most well thought out. I would argue that Edwin Munch's famous picture, The Scream, is a prayer. Sometimes the only prayer you can say is, prayer is not an address to a particular being. It is not a finely constructed set of words with a beginning and a middle and an end. It is not a set of instructions or a wish list or an accounting of sins and virtues. It is not a magical incantation. Prayer is your heart and soul expressing your deepest longings, your most profound fears, your most unspeakable joys and desires. Prayer is a communication between the heart and the very heart of mystery that is life. It is a process of allowing oneself to be open to illumination by that radiance, that wonder that is beyond all reason. Now, some years ago, I was living through a challenging period in my personal and professional life. I was leaving the church that I had served for 7 years, and the leaving was sad and complicated. I had come to care deeply for the congregation and the individuals in it, and I was finding it hard to let them go. A good friend of mine who had been fighting cancer for several years was dying. And then my cat disappeared. And all this forced me to pay more attention than usual to my own spiritual practices and to the meaning of prayer in my life. At a board meeting that particularly difficult week, I was talking about all these things that were distracting me from the business of the evening. And interestingly, I had almost the same conversation with a UU board member that I had had with my Methodist seminary classmate years ago. When you have a week like this, he said, do you pray? Yes, I answered. And who do you pray to? Although these questions came from somebody whose faith stance was diametrically opposite to that of my seminary friend, my answer was the same. Yes, I pray, but what I mean by prayer renders the who to question irrelevant. I did pray a lot that week. I didn't ask God to send Dina home. Dina, after all, was a cat, and by definition, her behavior fell outside of God's providence, by her belief and mine. I didn't ask God to stop eating the cancer in my friend's body. I did pray for the strength to get through the day and the resources to continue to attend to those things that I needed to attend to while my attention and my heart were really with my dying friend. I prayed for her family, that eventually they would find the resources to integrate their grief and loss into their lives and to continue to live. So yes, I pray, and ironically, today my form of prayer very often resembles the formula that Mimi gave me all those years ago, but with a slightly different understanding of the meaning of those words. I try to think of the things I am grateful for, especially on the bad days when I'm in a funk full of anger and sorrow or confusion. It is most helpful to try to cultivate gratitude, as many of you know. And so there's step one, be grateful. I also think about the things I'm sorry for. I know that the word confession is a loaded word for many of us, and I use it both with that awareness and also with the awareness that there is wisdom in every religious tradition that calls us to regular self-awareness. I try to review my day or my week. In 12-step language, it's called doing a moral inventory, and acknowledge the places where I have fallen short of myself and make note of the places where amends need to be made. And there is Mimi's step 2, confession. Then I think about the people I love, the people I serve, the people in the world in need. The Quaker prayer tradition is to hold the person you are praying for in the light, not forming words that will fix them or putting in a repair order, just holding them in loving consciousness. And there's step 3, the invocation of blessing. Then finally, I ask for what I want. I don't have a magic wish list that I deliver to the great magician in the sky, but I do have faith that I can find either within myself or in my connections to the world around me, the fortitude to live through whatever it is that must be lived through. Sometimes my prayer is simply for the forbearance to carry myself with grace through the next day or the next hour. And it is clear to me, a rational Unitarian Universalist adult, that when I am spiritually open, that prayer is always answered. And so, in that spirit of possibility, I want to close with another poem by the poet Denise Levertov. As swimmers dare to lie face to sky and water bears them, as hawks rest upon air and air sustains them, so would I learn to attain free fall and float into Creator Spirit's deep embrace, knowing no effort earns that all surrounding grace. Amen.